My daughter supported her mom's affair and called me a failure after I gave her my savings. Now she wants forgiveness because, a year ago, I had been happily married to my ex-wife Mia for 25 years when she suddenly confessed one night that she wanted a divorce. To say I was taken aback would be an understatement. There were no signs, no warnings leading up to this moment. She flatly told me that she no longer loved me and didn't find me attractive anymore. There was no remorse, no flicker of emotion in her eyes. I begged Mia to tell me if there was someone else, if she had found someone new, hoping that maybe we could through it. But she refused. She firmly kept telling me that she hated the way I looked and implied that I wasn't the man she had fallen in love with anymore. Her words stung, cutting deeper than anything I had ever experienced. And in a way, I couldn't argue with her. I knew I had let myself go a long time ago. When Mia and I first met, I was at the top of my game. I was a star basketball player in college, and I took my fitness very seriously. Back then, my body was my temple, and I was always pushing myself to stay in peak condition. I had a lot of admirers back then, but it all changed when I met Mia. After we got married and had our daughter, Jane, 24, female, reality hit hard, and the responsibilities of family life began to pile up. Mia had always wanted to be a homemaker, which meant that I had to step up and provide for our family financially. I took on extra shifts at work just to keep us afloat. Over the past 25 years, my job has become my priority. No matter how exhausted I was, no matter how sick I felt, I went to the office day in and day out. I never took sick days or allowed myself a break. My sole focus was on making sure that Mia and Jane had everything they needed. Their happiness, their comfort came first, and somewhere along the way, I stopped prioritizing myself. I no longer looked like the person I was all those years ago, and it hurt that my ex was leaving me just because of that. I knew there was something more to Mia's sudden desire for a divorce. It just didn't add up. So, later that week, I decided to act on my suspicions and hired a private investigator. One of my coworkers, who had gone through a similarly painful experience, had recommended this PI, and I was willing to try anything to get to the bottom of things. I needed answers, and I knew Mia wasn't going to give them to me willingly. It didn't take long for the investigator to uncover the actual truth. He found out that Mia was, in fact, cheating on me. She had been regularly meeting up with a man named George. The PI provided photos, undeniable proof that Mia was meeting up with him constantly throughout the day. I did a little digging myself and found George on social media. As soon as I saw the pictures, I knew. George came from a much wealthier background than me. He had the kind of money and lifestyle that I could never hope to provide. This was the real reason behind her decision to leave me. She wasn't leaving because of how I looked or because I had let myself go. She was leaving because she had found someone else. Someone she felt could offer her more. He could give her all the things I had spent the last 25 years trying so hard to provide, but never quite could. It felt like all my efforts, all my sacrifices for all these years, were meaningless now that she had found someone with a bigger bank account. While the PI continued to gather more information, I wanted to get my own proof as well, so one night, I waited until Mia had fallen asleep and checked her phone. My hands shook as I scrolled through her messages, taking screenshots of the conversations that confirmed what I already knew. The texts between her and George were graphic and disturbing. My ex-wife had told him in detail about how much she had come to hate me and how she didn't like being seen around me. Mia had wished she could have left me sooner, but obviously, she never could until she had found someone else. I was sure I had everything then and that this evidence would come in handy during my divorce. But a week later, the investigator sent me some new photos and provided me with some new information that had me reeling. He informed me that my daughter, Jane, knew about my ex-wife's affair and regularly met up with the guy. He showed me pictures which showed Jane meeting up with them. She looked happy and comfortable around George, which led me to believe that this affair had been going on for a long time. Clearly, both ex-wife and daughter knew what they were doing. I was floored. Did they plan to keep cheating on me and only break the news now that they both had everything? For some context, just before Mia announced that she wanted a divorce, I had made a huge financial decision, one that, at the time, felt like the right thing to do as a father. My daughter, Jane, had always dreamed of owning a house, something she had been talking about for as long as I can remember. It was her dream to have a place she could call her own, and she had been diligently saving up for it over the years. Every time we spoke, she would update me on how she was searching for houses within her budget, and it was clear how much this meant to her. A few months ago, before the divorce with my ex-wife, Jane had finally found the perfect house. It was exactly what she had been hoping for, but there was just one problem. It was largely out of her budget and she needed a couple $100,000 more in order to afford it. Jane came to me, practically begging for help. She asked me if I could give her the money to make up the difference. I'll be honest, it wasn't an easy decision for me to make. She was asking for my life savings, the money I had set aside over the years for emergencies, and for retirement. But I love my daughter more than anything in the world, and I couldn't bear the thought of her losing out on her dream because of money. After a lot of thought, I made the choice to give her everything I had saved. I figured that as a parent, sacrifices like this are part of the job. My parents had also helped me buy my house and had spent countless nights with us when Jane had first been born. My parents had done all this sacrifice for me without ever asking anything in return, so it made sense that I would do the same thing for my only child. I wanted Jane to be happy, and I believed this house would be the key to that. When I gave her my life savings, I asked her to not only use it to buy the house but also use the rest of the money on renovations, since the house was an older property and would definitely need work. I didn't want her to be in a situation where she was house rich but cash poor, struggling to maintain a home she couldn't afford to fix up. I also thought that by giving her a little extra, she'd have a safety net in case anything went wrong. At the time, I convinced myself that this was just money, and I could always earn more. I knew I'd be working for the foreseeable future, so I figured I'd eventually rebuild my savings. What mattered most to me in that moment was seeing Jane's dream come true. My daughter was over the moon when she finally got the keys to the house. She couldn't stop crying in my arms and thanking me for everything. This was why I was shocked when I discovered that Jane had been willingly meeting up with George behind my back and already knew about her mother's affair. Of course, after finding out about everything, the affair, the lies, I couldn't just sit with it in silence. I confronted both Mia and Jane. I told them there was no point in hiding or lying to me anymore because I already knew the whole truth. When I first brought it up, Mia's immediate reaction wasn't guilt or remorse, it was anger. She was furious that I had hired a private investigator to follow her around as if I had wronged her in some way. But I wasn't having it. I told her that if anyone had the right to be furious, it was me. She had been sleeping with another man behind my back, betraying the trust I had placed in her throughout our marriage. Her outrage only confirmed what I already knew: she had no respect for me anymore. Then I turned to Jane. She stood there looking embarrassed, clearly avoiding eye contact with me, her guilt written all over her face. It broke my heart to see her like that. She had always been my little girl, the one person I thought I could rely on no matter what. I asked her directly why she had been meeting with George. I could see her hesitation as she looked back and forth between me and her mother, and I noticed that Mia was shaking her head, silently signaling Jane to keep quiet. That only made me more determined to hear the truth. I told Jane how deeply hurt I was to see her with this man who had been destroying my marriage behind my back. I urged her to be honest with me, to finally tell me what had been going on. That's when Jane finally broke her silence and revealed everything. She told me that she had known Uncle George, the man Mia had been sleeping with, for a very long time, and that he was a good man. I froze when I heard her say this. It seemed like she knew this man quite well. I asked her when exactly she had first met Uncle George. She looked at me and hesitated before finally revealing that her mother had introduced him to her when she was 18. My eyes widened in disbelief as I realized what this meant. Mia had been having an affair with George for at least 6 years or even more. All this time, while I was working myself to the bone, making sacrifices for our family, Mia had been carrying on this secret relationship right under my nose. The betrayal wasn't just recent, it had been festering for years, growing in the shadows while I remained completely oblivious. I felt a mix of shock, anger, and heartbreak. It was as if the life I thought I knew was nothing but a lie. I couldn't believe that Jane had been aware of this for so long and hadn't said anything. The realization that my family, the people I loved most, had been keeping this secret from me for years was more than I could bear. Jane tried to justify her actions, explaining that when she first caught her mother with George, she was furious, just like I was. She said that at the beginning, it was hard for her to accept what her mother was doing, but over time, things changed. She claimed that the more she saw how happy George made Mia, the more she convinced herself that staying silent was the best choice. According to Jane, she didn't want to be the one to break up our marriage, as if her silence was somehow protecting the family. Mia, on the other hand, didn't even try to show remorse. Instead, she argued that it didn't matter how long the affair had been going on because, according to her, the only thing that mattered now was that she was divorcing me anyway and leaving me for good. She even tried to justify her deception by saying that the only reason she had stayed with me was for Jane's sake. She claimed that now that Jane was an adult, she didn't have to pretend to be in love with me anymore. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I scoffed at Mia's attempt to justify herself and pointed out that Jane had become an adult when she turned 18, 5 years ago. If Mia had truly only stayed with me for Jane's sake, she could have left back then, but she didn't. So why did she wait for 5 years to finally ask for a divorce? The answer was painfully clear. Mia wanted to make sure that this man, George, would fully commit to her, that he would take care of her financially and emotionally before she decided to leave me. She was hedging her bets, using me for financial support while ensuring that George was a sure thing before she took the plunge. She didn't even argue back because she knew I was right. I then turned to Jane and told her that while this entire situation was her mother's fault, I blamed her too for being such a coward. She could have told me the truth at any point in these 5 years, but instead, she chose to side with her mother. I accused her of loving her mother more than she loved me, despite the fact that Mia clearly was not a good parent to her. I was the one who went to work every day, who sacrificed my time, my energy, and my health to provide for our family loyally for all these years, while Mia enjoyed a life of comfort and carried on her affair behind my back. I reminded Jane of the fact that I had given up my entire life savings to help her buy her dream house, and yet she hadn't even blinked when she took my money, fully aware of the lies and betrayal going on behind the scenes. Jane started to apologize, her voice shaky, but I was too angry, too hurt to hear any of it. The weight of the betrayal was suffocating. I couldn't stand to be in that house any longer, so I walked out, leaving both of them there. As I left, I told Mia to make sure she was gone by the time I came back. I didn't want to see her face again after what she had done. I have to admit that I felt so used at the moment. I had given up my financial security for my daughter, while she and her mother had been clearly just using me. When I returned back home later that night, both Jane and Mia were gone. Fast forward to when our divorce was finalized. Mia, who had been fighting tooth and nail to get alimony, lost her case. The evidence I had gathered, the affair, the lies, was undeniable, and it worked in my favor. Since Jane was already an adult, I wasn't responsible for child support either. I walked away from the divorce without owing Mia a dime, and that infuriated her. She was livid, accusing me of leaving her without any financial security. She went on about how it was her right to get money from me, saying she had given up her entire life to take care of our home and feed me over the years. As for Jane, she had stopped talking to me after I had confronted her about her mother's affair. She had clearly sided with her mother during our divorce. She had made no efforts to reach out, or even apologize. I had decided to give her space and thought that over time, she would come around on her own. However, after Mia and my divorce were finalized, Jane sent me an email that felt like a knife twisting in my gut. In the email, Jane told me how disappointed she was in me for not giving her mother anything in the divorce. She said I was vindictive and that Mia had to walk away from our marriage empty-handed, as if I was somehow responsible for her mother's poor choices. Jane made it clear that she was relieved her mother had found a man like George, someone who had promised to give them a nicer and more luxurious life. It was almost surreal reading her words. She sounded like a stranger, no longer the daughter I had raised but someone who had fully aligned herself with her mother and George. Jane even wrote that these past few months without me in their lives had been stress-free. She said she enjoyed being around George and went as far as to call me a failure for not giving her and her mother a better life. Jane ended her email by saying that she never wanted to speak to me again. I remembered just staring at the email, unable to process the weight of it. Jane's betrayal stung more than anything Mia had done. My own daughter, someone I had loved, supported, and sacrificed so much for, had turned her back on me completely. She had chosen her mother's lies and George's money over me. It was as if I had been erased from her life, as if all those years meant nothing. It has taken me months of therapy to find closure and move on in my life. I have cried and fallen down several times, but, thankfully, my friends and family have never left my side. After the email, I have been in no contact with my daughter and learned to not miss her anymore. I feel like I have made a lot of progress in my life, which is why yesterday, when my daughter showed up at my door, out of nowhere I was genuinely taken aback. She looked like a mess. Her eyes were puffy and red, and it was obvious she had been crying. She asked me if she could come in and we could talk. For a moment, I hesitated. After all that had transpired, I wasn't exactly comfortable with the idea of letting her in, but I also was worried about her safety. No matter what had happened, this was still my daughter and a part of me wanted to hear her out first before I made any decision. So, I stepped aside and invited her in. We sat down, and I asked her, plain and simple, what she was doing at my doorstep after all this time. That's when Jane started to talk, her voice shaky at first, but soon she admitted that I had been right all along, that she had been foolish not to see things for what they were. She called her mother the devil, as she went on to explain that after my divorce from Mia, things had taken a turn for the worse in her own life. Mia and George had moved in together and were planning to get married soon, but things weren't as rosy as she had once thought. George, as it turns out, had kids of his own from previous marriages, and Mia was now bending over backward trying to win them over. Jane told me how her mother, now barely acknowledged her existence since the step-kids came into the picture. Mia had become consumed with pleasing George's kids, doing everything she could to be accepted by them. Jane described how her mother had all but abandoned her emotionally, spending no time with her and making it clear where her priorities lay. George's kids, as Jane explained, did not like Jane. They were very unpleasant to her and made her feel unwelcome. Jane described how, on multiple occasions, George would host dinner parties, inviting all his kids except her, conveniently leaving her out. She felt completely shut out from the new family dynamic. As Jane shared all of this, I could hear the pain in her voice. She felt completely rejected by the people she had once thought would become part of her new family. When Jane confronted Mia about the blatant favoritism, Mia brushed her off, telling her that George's kids deserved love and attention since they were still kids unlike Jane, and even going so far as to scold Jane for being so needy. At this point, Jane was in tears. She confessed that she had used some of the money I had given her, the same money I had sacrificed my life savings for, to help out her mother whenever she could. Jane had bought her mother gifts, as well as things for George's step-kids, hoping to win their approval and stay relevant in her mother's life. But now that the money had dried up, Mia's true colors had shown. With nothing left to give anymore, Mia had cast her aside like she was nothing. Jane realized that Mia didn't really care about her. She only cared about what she could get from her. Jane told me how for the past year, she had come to realize that everything I had told her a year ago was true. Her mother was selfish, manipulative, and only concerned with money. Mia had no problems using everyone around her, me, Jane, and now George, for her own gain, and once people had outlived their usefulness, she moved on without a second thought. I couldn't help but feel sorry for Jane as she sat there, pouring out her heart, finally realizing the harsh reality of the choices she had made. She had been a fool, and it had taken her this long to learn that painful lesson. But despite the pity I felt for her, I also knew deep down that things could never go back to the way they were. The trust between us had been shattered beyond repair. When Jane, through tears, asked if I could let go of the past and forgive her for everything so we could start things over, something inside me snapped. I laughed at her face, out of sheer disbelief. The audacity of it all, after everything she and her mother had put me through. I shook my head, still half amused by the absurdity of her request, and told her the plain truth: there was no forgetting what had happened. I couldn't just erase the years of betrayal and hurt as if they hadn't existed. I reminded her of how she had kept her mother's affair a secret from me for years, all while taking money from me for her own benefit, pretending that everything was fine. That wasn't something I could ever forgive. I told her, bluntly, that in that respect, she was truly her mother's daughter, manipulative and self-serving. She had inherited that trait from Mia, and I wasn't going to let her walk back into my life now, pretending like none of it had happened. I made it clear that she had chosen her side during the divorce. When the dust settled, she had stood by Mia and George, and now she would have to live with the consequences of that decision. I told her, flat out, that I had no loyalty left for her anymore. I had spent years sacrificing for her, only to have her betray me. That trust was gone, and there was no rebuilding it. Jane tried to argue, probably hoping to appeal to whatever paternal instinct was still left in me. But I was done. At the end of the day, she was an adult, and she needed to learn how to solve her own problems. Running to me for help, only when things went south with Mia and George, wasn't going to work. I had made peace with the fact that she had chosen them over me, and now, she would have to live with the consequences of that decision. I shut her down quickly and asked her to leave my place. I didn't want to hear any more about her problems with Mia or George. Frankly, I didn't care. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. Ever since then, my daughter's words have been circling in my head, and I will admit that I do feel a bit guilty about kicking her out without helping her. Am I the a-hole for what I did? Update 1. I'm relieved that the general consensus agrees I'm not at fault for not wanting to help my adult daughter after the way she betrayed me. I'm sure my daughter already knew about George's step-kids, but maybe she was always reassured that things could work out between all of them. However, now that she feels isolated and betrayed, she's turned to me for help, thinking I might take her in since both her mother and George have basically abandoned her. Well, I have no intention of doing that. She has to learn to live on her own, without her mommy or daddy bailing her out. And to everyone asking, no, I'm not going to ask my daughter to return the money I gave her for her house. Yes, it was my life savings, but at the time I loved her and wanted to do something meaningful for her. That will be the last gift I have ever given her, and I don't want the money back. I have a well-compensated job, and since my ex-wife is no longer with me, I've been able to save up quite a bit. Update 2. It's been almost a month since my last update. So, my daughter decided to reach out to my parents for help when she couldn't get through to me. My mother called to tell me that Jane had complained to her about her mother and her stepdad. She even said I was heartless for refusing to help her and accept her after she had shown up crying at my door. What surprised me most was that Jane had never been close to my parents before the divorce. She never liked spending time with her grandparents, but now she suddenly has turned to them. My mother asked if there was anything she and my dad could do for Jane, but I firmly told her not to entertain Jane's calls any further. I reassured her that I would handle the situation myself. After this, I texted Jane and asked her to meet me at a cafe. She immediately agreed. When I met my daughter, I told her she had no right to reach out to my parents for help behind my back. Jane tried to argue that she just missed having a family and felt lonely and miserable. I yelled at her, saying I knew exactly how she felt because I had experienced the same loneliness when she and her mother left me after the divorce. I reminded her that she had even sent me an email calling me a failure and then showed up a year later on my doorstep begging for my help. I told her I was sick of her manipulation and that she was testing my patience. Jane tried to argue, but I warned her that if she contacted my parents again, I would get a restraining order against her. My parents were old and didn't deserve this drama in their lives. I made it clear that if she desperately wanted a relationship with us, she needed to start paying me back the money I had given her. Hearing this, Jane argued that it was impossible for her to do so and that she could never pay me back. I scoffed and said, "Exactly. You can't, which is why you need to stay as far away from me and my family as possible." Since my conversation with Jane, I have also sent a voicemail to Mia, informing her about everything. I have asked her to talk to our daughter so that she stops bothering me and my family, otherwise, I would have to seek legal help. I am hoping that after this Jane leaves us alone. Update 3. It's been 5 months since my last update. Because everyone keeps asking me in my DMs, I want to clarify that Jane has not bothered my family again. After I sent the voicemail to Mia, she called me back to discuss everything and was genuinely surprised that Jane had come to us for help. My ex denied everything Jane had told me and instead provided a very different version of events. According to her, Jane was the one having difficulty blending in with the new family and had been quite rude to the stepkids. Mia said that she and George had tried their best, but Jane had refused to accept their family. She also clarified that everyone in the family buys gifts for each other, and Jane had done so once as well, but no one had ever forced her to buy gifts for anyone. She was really confused as to why Jane had lied to me about so many things, but honestly, I didn't know who to believe, so I simply told Mia that I just didn't care what happened between them. I wanted Jane to stay out of my life and that's it. Mia assured me that Jane would never bother me again, and I guess she kept her word because Jane has not been in touch with me or my parents after that. Last month, I went on a solo vacation for the first time in my entire life. I was so nervous at first, but then I really enjoyed meeting new people and experiencing a different culture. Life's good, and I have no complaints at the moment.